This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome everyone to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I am your host. And on today's podcast, we've got another great conversation. Alan Fadling. He serves as a frequent speaker and consultant with local churches, national organizations, and leaders internationally. His content is approachable, usable, and transferable. He shows leaders how to get perspective so their leadership flows from a full soul and out of healthy rhythms of rest and work. A trained spiritual director, Alan is the author of An Unhurried Life, An Unhurried Leader, and A Year of Slowing Down. And his latest book is A Non-Anxious Life. We'll leave links as always to all of his information and the books and where you can purchase them in the show notes. But this is a great conversation, especially this time of year, when we all at least try to slow down a little bit, do some reflecting, but to integrate this into a lifestyle and not just once a year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Richard, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Alan Fadling.
Well, those of you who listen to our podcast know that I particularly enjoy having special guests on that have expertise in many areas I do not, and also that are being used by the Lord to impact the world for Christ. And we have a very special guest today. Alan Fadling is the author of An Unhurried Life, Following Jesus' Rhythms of Work and Rest. And those of you who've listened to this podcast or know me personally know that this is not one of my strong points, being unhurried. This is an area that I definitely need this book for, and I think you'll discover why as we unpack this podcast. But Alan, welcome to the podcast today.
Richard, thank you so much for the invite. I've been looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I have to tell you, this was a book I read not just out of my own interest in issues related to leadership, but there are some books, just by the title, I have to brace myself and say, okay, God, let me have it. I know it's coming. And this was certainly one of them. And as you write this book, you start off and tell a bit of your story. And in the beginning, you sound like a typical minister, coming into a church, wanting to do a good job, trying to have success. But along the way, it's like you had a divine appointment. God kind of intercepted you, and everything changed. Well, could you tell us a little bit about that journey so we kind of know how you started out and what caused you to take a 90-degree turn along the way?
Well, thank you for asking. I was mentored in ministry like many of us who are in pastoral sort of roles in what I would now call a rather hurried mode of church leadership. It's kind of like the more that's on the calendar, the better. The more hours you're putting in at church, the better. And I was young. I was working full-time in a local church. I was attending a nearby seminary full-time. I was newly married. I'm sort of sad to say maybe my priorities were about in that order. I was burning out at 28.
Wow.
Now that's bad pacing. If you're burning out at 28, you're not thinking marathon, and I really had a crisis of ministry, not so much a crisis of faith, but I just knew I couldn't keep doing what I was doing, how I was doing it for much longer. And it was really at that time, it was about 1990, when God brought some mentors into my life, and they were just as engaged in important work, but their souls were running at a different pace. And that encounter put me on what Eugene Peterson calls a long obedience in the same direction that has now been 30-some years.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, you talk a lot about speed and just the speed in our culture, speed for those who are working. And you have some great quotes throughout your whole book. A couple of those I really appreciate. You call yourself a recovering speed addict. And I love this question. You said, why do I rush through this world as though it were an all-you-can-eat buffet right before the restaurant closes and the serving trays are about empty? And I've been there. I've been that guy trying to get my money's worth at the buffet line. And sometimes I think that's a great description of life, just rushing through. And one last quote you had there, the pace of my life often feels much less like a playful breeze and much more like a hurricane. So why is it? What is it about, and especially a ministry? I mean, people that are serving God, serving in the church, you'd think that we would have a more of a divinely set pace, but I mean, sometimes we're going as fast or faster than a lot of folks just out there working in the business world.
Yeah, I've been in a ministry sort of role for 40 years, my whole adult life. And there are probably a lot of reasons that I think we struggle in this way. One of the ones that's come into focus for me is that it's the old idea that a lot of us think we are what we do. And so if you believe that, of course, doing more only makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, doing less is an exercise in proving you're a nobody.
Yeah.
So, but if who I am is more of a gift God's giving me than a paycheck that I'm earning, that will change the pace of my life. Instead of feeling like I need my work to prove something about who I am, what I learn is that work is just one of the many good places I get to share who I am. And so that unhurried pace to me is more about a life that's rooted in grace. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't really see ourselves and our identity as a gift God's giving us.
Well, you know, Alan, I was a pastor's kid, and I don't know. I guess I was a little sensitive about. I mean, my dad was as hard a working a guy as any I knew, but I almost, it was almost like the one insult. I've been insulted in many different ways over the course of my life, but the one thing even my enemies never said about me was that I was lazy, and I just felt like if you're serving God, you ought to be the hardest working guy out there because you've got the most important work to do. And I saw pastors that I just felt were fairly lazy. They had a pretty good gig, you know, show up on Sunday and pretty open, unaccountable schedule for most of the week. And so I just vowed that wasn't going to be me. But of course the pendulum can swing way, way too far the other way. I mean, if you're trying to prove something, how much do you have to do until you feel like you've actually proved it?
Exactly.
But
and the answer to that is just a little more, right?
Just a little, exactly. Yeah. Well, you talk a lot about rest, and I think there's a lot of people listening, whether you're a pastor or you're a business person, whatever it is you do. There's a lot of tired people out there, and when you talk about rest, though, you're not talking about just a power nap. There's a much, much deeper rest that has much longer lasting implications. And what do you mean by that? In having a life of where you pace yourself and you're getting the kind of rest that your soul as well as your body needs? Yeah.
Well, I think this is important. And I think your comments about laziness are important because for a lot of us, rest sounds like laziness. Like, you know, why would you want any more of that in your life? You know, I've talked about these ideas in India where the caste system is such that, you know, those who are considered more important or higher up on the levels, the last thing they want to be seen is as lazy, like some of those below them as they see themselves. But I think we have a lot of reasons why we struggle. I love a line in the Psalms. One of the older NIV versions said, "My soul finds rest in God alone." And the minute you hear that sentence, you know that's not about necessarily just sleep or vacation or nap or whatever. It's a deeper reality. Wow. So it's about living my life with the awareness that I have what I need because God is my shepherd. It's grace and peace as the atmosphere of my life. And so I think for some of us, we see the word rest, and what we really think we're seeing is the word work with a slash through it. Like, I'm not working, and therefore I'm not producing, and therefore I'm not important, and I don't matter. But rest is a gift from God just as surely as work is a gift from God. And in some ways, even in the story of the Scriptures, the first full day of human existence is a day of rest. And I think that matters because rest is where I remember who I am. And that way, work becomes the place I get to express who I am. If work is where I prove who I am, then rest has no place in my vision.
Wow. So what do you do? I mean, there are listeners here, I'm sure, that are saying, hey, Alan, I would love to have that rest. I'm exhausted. I'm stretched as thin as I could be. Where do you even begin? I mean, I mean, anytime someone asks the question, the audience, are you going too hard? Are you going too fast? Do you need to rest? I'll put my hand up, but then I don't know what to do about it. I'm kind of stuck. You feel like you're on the treadmill and you can't get off.
Well, I just recently did a little bit of writing for one of our podcast episodes about rest. And one of the things that I had never really thought deeply about this, but think of how many different ways God builds rest into the life of Israel. He gives them a weekly Sabbath, which often they weren't even able to honor because, their slavery in Egypt, they had no choice. They couldn't take a day to rest as God had invited them. There were feast days. There was an every 7 years rest for the land, which maybe is a rationale for some of the ideas of sabbatical we're hearing more and more about these days. God gave his people more rest than we realize. And I think he's giving us more rest than we realize. So, for example, Sabbath, what if every week you took a day and instead of measuring it by productivity, you just enjoyed it? You enjoyed the people God's given you. You enjoyed the place where God's planted you. You enjoyed a bit of rest, whatever rest looks like, and rest can look different for different folks.
Yeah.
For extroverts and introverts, it can look different.
Yeah.
But
And, I think you
had a day
get
like
into that in the book, but rest isn't necessarily just watching 4 hours of sitcoms on TV in the evening, right? Because you can be not working in a sense and yet emotionally, spiritually not be in any way rested after that activity. There's certain kinds of activities, I think, that rest your emotions, rest your soul, besides just, mindlessly just, ODing on media and things like that.
I think you're exactly right. And in fact, I think the challenge is, maybe the way I would say it is, we've usually been taught pretty well how to work. We've had mentors for work. Not very many of us have been taught how to rest.
Yeah.
We really just don't even know how to do it. So a lot of us, I think we settle for numbing rather than moving on to resting. The problem with numbing is when you're numb, you don't feel tired. But that doesn't mean you're getting refreshed. It just means you don't feel tired. There's a difference.
Yeah, great point. Well, you have a number of phrases I really liked, and one of those you talk about moving at the pace of grace. That really caught my attention. What does that look like? It sounds wonderful, but what does that mean, moving at the pace of grace?
Well, one of my mentors, his favorite biblical idea was the grace of God. And he would say that grace is God's empowering presence. Grace is God's great and generous provision for us. Grace is, to use a theological word, it's his prevenient initiative. He's working before I'm working. And so for me, pace of grace is a way of saying, I see my life as a gift. I see my work as a gift. I see my relationships as a gift. And so instead of imagining that my life is full of things I have to achieve or earn or deserve, I'm actually living a life where I am absolutely surrounded by generosity. That changes what happens in my soul. It changes how I treat people. I don't find myself as often treating people as someone I need something from. I find I can go to those people and I can bring something to them. And so grace has a way of slowing us down on the inside in the best sense so that we could be maybe more loving, more peaceful, more kind. All of those are slower virtues, I think.
Well, and if you realize God is the one guiding you, he works in your life with grace. If you're feeling, he's not going to guilt you. He's not going to put a guilt trip on you to do more.
Right.
And there's so many, if you understand the voice and the ways of God, it's always going to be with grace. And you can trust that. You can trust that grace. It's for your own well-being. And I love that phrase. And I'm working on a project right now myself on discipleship, and my definition of being a disciple is if I just boil it right down, I would say discipleship is following Jesus. It's not just believing in Jesus, not worshiping Jesus, studying about Jesus. It is getting out of your boat and following him where he leads you, and being with him and fellowshipping with him and listening to him, learning as you follow him, not learning by going to a study at the church once a week. And so I was really pleased when you talk about a point in your ministry, working with others, where you said we were learning to follow Jesus together. The focus was less and less on our activities for him and more on our working with him. We were learning how to follow him. And then you conclude, say, and it was one of the hardest years of my life in ministry.
Yeah.
Why would that be? Because you'd been successfully growing your ministry before, but as you start to teach people to follow Jesus, that's, you can have someone show up, you can have them memorize a scripture verse every week, you can have them complete a curriculum, but why is it so hard to teach people to follow Jesus?
Well, one way I would say it is that though it is a hard way to live, when you turn the Christian life into things to manage and things to do, it feels more like you can wrap your arms around it. It feels like you can figure it out and control it. When you start getting out in the wild west of people's actual lives and their struggles and their temptations and their wounds and their stories, and try to help real people connect with the real God, that just ends up being messier than you expect. That was my experience.
Yeah. Well, and with the background that I have with experiencing God, my dad would just say it's a lot easier to be involved in religious activity than to develop a relationship with Jesus, where you actually have to know his voice and know where he's taking you. Just tell me what I need to do. What rituals? What am I supposed to believe? I'll just do all that. But developing a relationship, that takes time.
That's exactly right.
And like any relationship. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, I realized in those early years of ministry for me, the ministry was mostly whatever the latest cool thing was. And so I can look over the last 40 years and see a whole string of this is what was really exciting and important in the church. And my ministry was just kind of going from thing to thing to thing, figuring out what the program was, mastering it, implementing it, getting people excited, getting people involved, getting people tired, and then getting people sick and tired of this thing we were doing. So right about then, I would look for whatever's the next thing to get them excited about, get them involved in, get them busy with, and eventually tired of. The thing is that life with God never happens like that. There's always something new. There's always something fresh, that his love is new every morning. There's something alive about communion with God that just isn't true when you're implementing the latest cool program that everybody else is doing.
Yeah. We've mentioned this on the podcast before, but my oldest son is a church planter. And when he went through COVID and came out the other side, it broke his heart. The people that didn't come back, and he basically, what really impacted me, he said, "Dad, what I realized was, I'd been making church attenders. I had not been making disciples." He said it was all about getting people to be there at the service each week, and if they came relatively often, I felt I was successful as a pastor. But he said, had they been disciples, they'd have come back. They'd still be here. But they're just, if all you're doing is showing up for a service or something, that there's just a whole lot more to discipleship than that. And just so it takes more work. You make an interesting statement. You say genuine productivity is not about getting as much done for God as we can manage. It's doing the good work God actually has for us in a given day. And then you ask on the next page, what if I learn to work from a place of unhurried abiding? Now that almost sounds like a contradiction in terms, getting things done and unhurried abiding. I know there's some type A's listening to this that are saying, aren't those like mutually exclusive? How, if you're just abiding in an unhurried way, how are you going to get anything done?
Yeah, no, that's fair. So one of the things I always want to say is that when I talk about unhurried, some busy leaders think I don't get much done. And I get that. I understand. But I will also say that someone like Thomas Merton said that sometimes busyness is the most insidious form of laziness. There are ways to be busy that get very little done that matters. I've had whole days filled with things I got done that I got to the end of and wondered, did any of that actually matter? Will I care about that tomorrow, let alone a year or 5 years from now?
Yeah.
So to me, one of the ways to get at this is Jesus is the one who invites us to abide. He's the one who says, I'm the real vine, you're the branch. If you remain in me and I remain in you, you'll bear much fruit. Apart from me, nothing.
Yeah, and we don't believe that part, do we? Verse 5.
No.
Apart from me, you can do nothing. We don't really, you can tell we don't believe it because there's a lot of pastors who say they're too busy to abide.
That's exactly right. And so what I want to say is, if you think about it, a farmer doesn't create wheat. A farmer does all kinds of things that helps wheat grow, but wheat grows because God grows wheat. That's true for souls as well. What we do, in my case as a pastor, I don't cause people to become disciples. I cooperate with the Jesus who invites them to be disciples. And I am a co-disciple. I'm alongside them. I'm walking with them. I'm learning to follow just as they are learning to follow. And that indirectness of fruit that will last is one of the things I think we really struggle to understand. Like when I look, one of the ways I would say it is when I look back 5, 10, 20, 30 years, I almost never think about my ministry in terms of things I did. I almost always think about people I walked alongside in those seasons.
Wow.
I think that's an unhurried way and a more fruitful way to do whatever work God's given us to do.
You know, my dad was the most impactful person I ever knew. And yet he was always abiding. He was always had his Bible open and was spending time with God. And what I learned from my dad is you can't give to others what you don't have yourself. And so he kept filling himself up with God. And I tell you what, you don't have to encounter God for very long to experience a great impact. And I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and told me that they had a 10-minute conversation with my dad that changed their life forever. And I'm thinking, you know, if you can change a life in 10 minutes, how can you do it? You don't have to spend hours and hours. You just have to be so full up of Jesus that when they encounter you after just 10 minutes of the overflow of your abiding with Jesus, and their life may never be the same again. So I've seen it's not. It used to be I'd have to counsel someone 2 or 3 hours and hope that I got them to move an inch, and I realized, but if I've been abiding and I'm full of God and His Word and His Spirit, boy, I tell you what, you don't need long before God makes a difference in that person's life. And the last book that I wrote that came out this year is called The Ways of God, and so I was delighted when I saw that you get into that as well. I always like that when other writers and people are affirming things that I thought were important.
Pretty nice.
So that's when I know I really like the authors, when they have a similar viewpoint to me. But you said we must learn to follow Jesus' way rather than our own. And then you said, do you and I sometimes try and do God's will, but not in God's way? And finally, you said His unchanging methods have been very effective for a long time. Why is that? I mean, why is that important? Why would you say taking time to understand God's way as opposed to just charging out the gate and doing the best that we can? Yeah,
well, to me, again, this brings us back to those lines from Jesus in the upper room when He describes Himself as the true vine. If He says that, then it means there are also false vines that we try to attach ourselves to. And the thing about false vines is they suck from us. They don't give to us. You know, they suck life. They draw away our life. So I think the ways of God are going to be rooted in what matters to God. And we know what matters to God. He calls them great commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. That has worked for thousands of years. and it still works today. And so, the ways of God are going to be rooted in a way of living and a way of working that fosters a deeper communion and conversational relationship with God. But it's also going to look like a way of living and working that blesses people, that shows practical, measurable love for neighbor. And so therefore, the ways of God are going to look a whole lot like the fruit of the Spirit. It's going to look loving and joyful or peaceful or patient or kind or good. That is actually essential to at least my understanding of what the ways of God are.
Of course, God says in Isaiah 55, our ways are not his ways. Our natural instinct is not to do things God's way. We've been immersed in the world's ways our whole life. And so my dad used to always say, if a plan makes sense to me, it probably didn't come from God because he said, because I just would not come up with the way God would do it. But of course, his ways glorify him, and the world's ways tends to glorify us. And so we've often said in this podcast, it's possible to do the right thing, but to do it the wrong way. And that confuses a lot of people because they meant well, they just did it the wrong way. And so I was great. And you quote, you've got some great quotes. I really appreciate just the breadth of your reading and some of the folks that you've planted your life alongside. And my dad introduced me to Elton Trueblood when I was starting out in ministry as well. And I've got a bunch of his books. And you quote him as saying, a person who is always available is not worth enough when he is available.
Ouch.
That's like, oh, burn. What does that mean? If you're always available, you may not be worth all that much when people get you.
Yeah, so that quote comes in a passage where Trueblood is talking about his encouragement to take a day a month to go away and be with Jesus. And that it was a rhythm, no matter how busy his life got as a philosopher, a professor, an author, a speaker, all the things that filled his schedule, he set aside some part of a day. And in that passage, he says, those of us who are busy will know how hard it is to practice a discipline like this. But the fact that it's hard doesn't mean that it's not good.
Yeah.
And so to me, those rhythms of stepping back, what Dallas Willard called the disciplines of abstinence or disciplines of disengagement. Those are the places where we experience filling, so that our work, instead of giving the last 3 drops of what's happening in our soul, it's the overflow of what's happening in my soul. So we can go to someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, who loved the image of a reservoir, which is to say a reservoir at its best, although in California it hasn't worked this way for the last few years, a reservoir at its best keeps a level and gives what is excess downstream. I think that is a beautiful image of what ministry or work of any sort could be, that I could go to the places I go from a place of fullness of soul and then give from that fullness without doing harm to my soul.
My dad always talked about just ministering out of the overflow. And the problem for many of us is that we're empty and we're still trying to minister and we have nothing to give. And to actually have time where you pull away to fill your cup back up is not, I know a lot of people feel guilty for that, but if you've got nothing to give, it's you're past due just to pull away and take that time, and you don't have to feel guilty because it's only going to benefit everyone around you when you've filled yourself back up. And you said an interesting thing about Sabbath. I really like the way you said it. You said God never meant Sabbath to be an enslaving you can't day as much as a freeing you don't have to day. And I think a lot of us, especially a lot of the folks that are driven type A's, we just don't do Sabbath very well. And what do you mean by you don't have to day? Because I think we don't necessarily understand what Sabbath is even for, do we?
I think we really struggle as a culture. I recently was talking to a group, and one of the things I said was that we tend to have a very, very strong work ethic, but almost no rest ethic. We don't see the goodness of rest.
Yeah.
We think it's a not category. It's a negation. It's an empty spot. It's a vacuum, I think Sabbath is in some ways the most substantial day of the week, if you understand what it is.
Huh.
It's a day for giving God the gift of your full attention as best you can. It's a day to enjoy and celebrate the good things God gives. It's a day to be filled with thank yous instead of more accomplishments or achievements or activities. In the Old Testament, one of the phrases Leviticus and Numbers especially uses is the Sabbath was a day to do no regular work. That's an interesting phrase. The work that would usually fill a day, Sabbath is a day where you don't have to do that. I just realized that a lot of times my work has been driven by a feeling of have to rather than by a feeling of get to. And so that's why I think a Sabbath day is that day where I get to be a dad, a husband, a human being, a child of God. And that gets to shape my agenda for the day rather than a servant, a worker, an employee, a boss, an owner, those roles that are also part of my life. When I live Sabbath well, that becomes a kind of reservoir that overflows into my work week.
And of course, we've got Monday facing us. If you're taking your Sabbath on a Sunday, then you've got a whole work week ahead of you. And I would think that how you do that Sabbath could have huge implications for how you enter into that work week. If you've been just working and wearing yourself out and spending yourself on that day too, then you're going into the week, half empty to start with, and or more. And there's a lot, and I don't know that I've necessarily always done that well, but I'm as I get older, I think, and busier, I'm seeing that Sabbath more and more as a gift, not a burden, not an obligation, but what a gift to not feel guilty about just being able to just sort of slow down and embrace those good things in life before another busy week.
Well, I wonder if we could imagine that we actually practice a discipline like Sabbath, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of others.
Yeah.
Like maybe they need me to rest. Yeah. Maybe they don't need me to be the frantic, busy person I am. Maybe it would help even other people if I took a day and didn't measure it by what I was producing and gave myself to people just as a person instead of a provider of goods or an achiever of goals or whatever.
Wow. Well, I've got just a couple more questions. We could talk for a long time because you had just page after page of quotes that made me stop and think. But you said an interesting statement as well when you said, if our longings were always easily fulfilled, they might not have the opportunity to become deeply rooted. And of course, waiting on the Lord can be such a challenging thing sometimes, and sometimes it's confusing. It's like, God, what I'm asking for is a good thing. Why are you not giving that to me? And yet, God never seems to be in as big of a hurry as we are. What do you mean by that? Why might God be delaying, perhaps, or going slower than we would like Him to in our life?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably more than one answer to that. One thing I would say is that when it comes to our desires, temptation is almost always rushing us to do something now. Chase that now. You need this solved now. That's probably just a good thing to keep in the back of our minds. In terms of one reason why God may seem to delay is He's trying to protect us from chasing down something we think we want, we think we need, that may not be as good for us as we imagine it. But the other thing I would say is that I think one of the reasons God will sometimes seem to delay, seem to be slow as it relates to what we're concerned for and asking for, is that what we think we need is something from God, when actually what we most need is God. There's a big difference. And I can get so riveted to the thing I want from God that it can become a virtual idol in my soul. Now, I'm not saying that's true of every request, but I can get awfully attached to what I want God to do so that it's not as easy for me to be attached to just who God is. And there is a big difference. So I think as we move forward in our journey with God, there'll be moments where what I hope for, what I want may not come immediately, but that may be the chance for me to remember, no, my soul finds rest in God alone. Oh God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you.
Yeah.
My body longs for you. My soul thirsts for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. That's a good thing for my soul, to realize what I most deeply and truly want.
Yeah. And sometimes that waiting helps us focus. I think we're just used to snapping our fingers and having everything at our disposal. And I think sometimes God he waits until he's got our full attention. We know how much we need him. And then the gifts come along with that. But, well, two last questions for you. One is, people that have listened to me know that probably of all the things my dad teaches, what he's got more pushback on than anything else is that he has the audacity to say that God actually communicates with people. And you don't, there are people, there are Christians who get scared to death of what that could lead to. People start hearing from God all the time. But I suspect, and I really appreciate you talking about this, the slowing down, the things that you can hear when you're not running at breakneck speed. And when you rest and you have Sabbath and you build that margin into your life where it's amazing where all of a sudden you start hearing things that perhaps you couldn't hear when you were going faster. And what might be some encouragement with people who are saying, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I'm going 90 miles an hour. I haven't heard from God for a long time. I'm just trying to keep my head above water. What encouragement maybe that some of these practices might just help you to hear from God better?
Yeah, so I appreciate, the pushback that your dad experienced. Dallas Willard's first book was In Search of Guidance. It was really about listening to God. And Richard Foster's early works, in many ways, those practices were about cultivating a kind of listening relationship with God. I just think that's what a relationship with God is. I can hardly imagine a relationship with no communication.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is that practices that had helped me slow down, like a day a week that's not measured by productivity, like an occasional day where I follow Jesus to the lonely place to pray, like Luke reports in chapter 5, moments to be still and simply do nothing more than to remember that God is God. I need that. My soul needs that. I need to remember God's God and I'm not God. That's a bad habit of mine, to imagine I'm the one in charge of everything. I'm the one running everything. And I've just discovered the reason I have sometimes not heard God is I'm going too fast to hear the voice of God. I'm like driving, freeway speed on a long straight stretch of road, and everything's a blur right next to me. Whereas I have had the joy of cycling a lot of the West Coast, and when you're cycling, that's a lot slower, and you see more, you enjoy more, you notice more. I've just seen that when I slow down inside, I notice more. And what's included in that is I notice the hand of God at work. I notice the voice of God speaking. I notice the presence of God with me in ways that I don't at a more hurried pace.
And you talk in your book about just getting away, just getting out, looking out on a mountain, or just getting out into nature and and of course we all would like to do that. We all think we don't have time to. But just getting out of the normal pace, the normal view that you have, and getting somewhere perhaps where it's uncluttered or more nature, and you might just be surprised what you hear. Well, one last question, and I thought this was very interesting, and I was challenged by this. You help organizations. You'll come in and they're trying to find direction, maybe develop plans for the future, and you come in to help them with that. And then a practice that you use a lot is, why don't you take so much time at the beginning and go separately and just listen? And I've had groups, that really wanted to get a whole detailed plan and all spelled out and with subpoints, and you're taking the first 30 minutes to just go away and listen? That seems so impractical. And yet, as you share, oftentimes, even though you've taken a bit of time at the front end to basically try to hear from God, the results are much richer, and you actually can accomplish more if you've done more than just say a token opening prayer before you get down to your own thinking the rest of the day.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And I think what we don't realize is what people bring to the meetings we lead, whether those are board meetings or staff meetings, whether those are longer strategic planning meetings. If you've got somebody who's bringing great woundedness in their soul, great discouragement, great weariness, and you don't address it, then that will impact every agenda item you talk about for however long you are together. The reason board meetings go too long is rarely about the agenda. It's more about the souls and the condition of souls of the people around the room. And so that's why I think, I have a hard time imagining Jesus with his disciples taking 5 minutes to say a real quick prayer and then talk about the plans for their mission for the next 3 weeks. I just have a hard time imagining that's how Jesus would conduct himself with his inner circle. What I have seen it time and time again, one time, I could tell you a long version, here's the short one. There was a university, they were facing some significant challenges. They had a 3-day strategic planning retreat that probably was going to make or break the university's future. I propose we spend the first day of the 3 with God, in community, praying. And if it weren't for the fact that the president was a friend and had already been a part of some retreats, that never would have happened.
Yeah, that was a pretty bold request.
It was pretty scary. She was very nervous. And so day 2, hour 1, we're starting on the agenda, which probably could have filled 3 days easy. But here's what happened. People were rested. People were encouraged. People were connected with one another. People had a sense that God's favor was with them, even though they were facing insurmountable challenges. And then when we started asking really hard questions about the next year and the next 5, there was creativity. There was insight. When there was a disagreement, it wasn't a disagreement between enemies. It was a disagreement between brothers and sisters. It was much easier to move past the disagreement to a point of agreement on one person's perspective. In the end, that 3-day meeting ended in the middle of day 3. And they had an afternoon, having finished the agenda well, to just celebrate what God was doing among them. My argument is sometimes unhurried is quicker than hurried.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I knew our time would race by because you have got just so many rich insights. And you have a new book that's coming out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, in February of 2024, my new book, which is titled A Non-Anxious Life, subtitle is Experiencing the Peace of God's Presence. It's not a sequel to these unhurried books that I've written, but it's a follow-on. Because the more I talk with folks about hurry, the more I realize a lot of our hurry is rooted in anxiety. I know mine is. And so this is maybe the most personal book I've written, and I'm really excited about its coming out in a few months.
Wow. And we'll leave links to how you can get that or pre-order that so that it gets into your mailbox as soon as it's released. But Alan, thank you for this book. I really recommend this book to our listeners. They're just, I think it's so chronic across the culture today. Good people wanting to make a difference and yet sometimes exhausted, burned out, and just sensing in your heart that there just ought to be a better way. Surely serving God, you shouldn't be burning out when you're trying to follow God's will. Certainly that's not the direct, he would not lead you to burnout. So we know we've gotten off the rail somewhere along the way. And so thank you, Alan. We'll please check all the show notes. You'll see a list of his books and how to get them and his website, podcasts. He's just got a wealth of great information, and I really encourage you to go there and avail yourself of that. And so thank you, Alan. You have given me new resolve to go back and do what I think God is trying to get me to do for not just my own benefit, but from everybody else around me as well. So thank you for being with us.
Well, it's good to be in recovery together, and it was nice to be able to visit with you. Thanks for the invite.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.